They say a father's silence can be louder than a scream, and I learned that truth the hard way on the day my son turned 26, when he looked me dead in the eyes and said the best gift I could give him was to disappear from his life forever. No cake, no hug, no memory, just vanished like I never existed. And I didn't argue, didn't cry, didn't ask why, I just smiled, the kind of smile that holds back 1,000 storms. And I walked out of that house with my hands in my pockets and my heart dragging behind me like a broken suitcase, because when your own blood tells you to leave, you don't fight, you surrender. And as I stepped into the street, the sun was still shining like it didn't know what just happened, like it didn't care, and I kept walking, past the bakery where I used to buy him chocolate donuts when he was 5, past the park where he learned to ride his bike and crashed into my knees laughing, past the corner store where he once stole a candy bar and cried when I made him return it, all those places still standing while my world collapsed. And somewhere in the middle of that walk, I whispered to myself, maybe this is what love looks like when it dies quietly. And I didn't know where I was going, just knew I couldn't go back, not yet, not ever, maybe. And while I was sitting on a bench outside the old train station, watching pigeons fight over crumbs, my phone buzzed, and I ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again, until I finally looked, and it was my neighbor, frantic, saying cops were outside my house, saying my son was in handcuffs, saying something about assault, about threats, about a meltdown. And I didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the screen like it was lying to me, like it was some twisted joke. But it wasn't, and I felt this cold wave crash over me, not because he got arrested, but because I wasn't surprised, because deep down I knew something was broken in him, something I couldn't fix, something I might have helped break. And that's when I realized this wasn't just his birthday, it was the funeral of everything we used to be. And maybe I was the ghost haunting his life, maybe my presence was the weight he couldn't carry, maybe my love felt like a cage to him. And I started thinking about all the times I tried to be the man he needed, all the times I failed, all the nights I stayed up wondering if I was raising a son or surviving one. And I wanted to cry but the tears wouldn't come, like my soul was too tired to leak anymore. And right there, in the middle of that bench, I looked up at the sky and said, God, if you're listening, tell me what a father's supposed to do when his child becomes his punishment. And the sky didn't answer, just kept glowing like it was proud of its silence. And I know this story ain't easy to hear, but if you're watching this right now, I want to welcome you to my truth, and I need you to tell me, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon, and let me know what kind of stories hit you hardest, because this one's just beginning, and I promise you, it's gonna cut deep. And as I sat there thinking about the boy who once called me his hero and now wanted me erased, I remembered the time he broke his arm falling from the tree in our backyard and cried for me like I was the only thing that could fix him. And I wondered how we got from that to this, how love turns into resentment, how birthdays become battlegrounds. And I kept replaying his words in my head, I want you gone, like a curse, like a prophecy. And I thought maybe he didn't mean it, maybe it was pain talking, maybe it was years of silence between us finally exploding. But then again, maybe he meant every word, and maybe I was the villain in his story, the shadow he couldn't outrun. And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the streetlights flickered on like tired eyes, I stood up, brushed the dust off my jeans, and started walking again, not toward home, not toward him, but toward whatever comes next, because sometimes the only way to love someone is to leave them, and maybe, just maybe, that's the gift he really needed. The sirens came like thunder chasing lightning, loud and sudden, slicing through the quiet street where I used to teach my son how to throw a football. And when I turned the corner, I saw the flashing red and blue lights painting the walls of our house like a crime scene from a movie I never wanted to star in. And there he was, my son, standing on the porch with his fists clenched, his jaw locked, his eyes wild like a man possessed. And the cops were talking to him, calm but firm, like they were trying to talk a bomb out of exploding, and I didn't move, just watched from across the street, hidden behind the shadow of a tree that had seen better days, and I remembered the way he used to run into my arms after school, backpack bouncing, voice full of stories, and now he was yelling, pointing, saying things I couldn't hear but could feel in my bones, and one officer stepped forward, reached for his wrist, and my son jerked back, like a cornered animal, and that's when they grabbed him. 3 of them, fast and practiced, like they'd done it 100 times before, and he fought, not with punches but with words, screaming that I ruined his life, that I was the reason he couldn't breathe, that I was the ghost that haunted every room he walked into, and I wanted to run to him, to tell him I was sorry, to tell him I never meant to be the weight on his chest, but my feet wouldn't move, like the ground had swallowed me whole, and as they cuffed him and pushed him into the back of the cruiser, he looked up, eyes scanning the street, and for a second, just 1 second, our eyes met, and I saw it, regret, confusion, maybe even fear, and I wanted to believe that meant something, that maybe he didn't hate me as much as he thought, but then the door slammed shut and the car pulled away, leaving behind silence and a porch full of broken memories, and I walked up slowly, like a man approaching his own grave. And the neighbor came out, eyes wide, voice shaking, saying he'd called the cops because my son had threatened to burn the house down, said he smashed a picture frame and punched a hole in the wall, said he kept shouting that I abandoned him, that I ruined his birthday, and I just nodded, like I understood, like I agreed, but inside I was drowning in questions, in guilt, in the kind of pain that doesn't bleed but still kills, and I stepped into the house, into the mess, into the chaos, and saw the shattered glass on the floor, the torn photo of me holding him as a baby, the dent in the wall where his anger had landed, and I sat down on the couch, the same couch where we used to watch cartoons and eat popcorn, and I whispered, "What did I do wrong?" But the walls didn't answer, just stared back with judgment, and I thought about calling someone, anyone. But who do you call when your son becomes a stranger, when your love turns into poison, when your home becomes a battlefield? And I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time we laughed together. The last time he said, "Dad," without venom, and I couldn't, it was all buried under years of silence, of missed chances, of words I should have said but didn't, and I knew this wasn't just about today, this was about everything, about the way I worked too much, about the nights I came home too tired to listen, about the times I told him to toughen up instead of asking what hurt, and maybe he was right, maybe I was the villain in his story, and maybe disappearing was the best gift I could give, but damn, it hurts to be erased by someone you built from scratch, and as the night crept in and the house grew colder, I sat there in the dark, waiting for a phone call, a sign, anything, and all I got was silence, the kind that wraps around your throat and squeezes, and I knew tomorrow would come, and with it, questions from the cops, maybe court dates, maybe therapy, maybe nothing, but tonight, all I had was this, an empty house, a broken photo, and the echo of a birthday wish that shattered everything. The next morning felt like a hangover without liquor, just heavy air and a heart that wouldn't stop pacing inside my chest, and I sat at the kitchen table staring at the coffee I didn't make, the chair he used to sit in, the silence that used to be filled with his voice, and I kept thinking about the way the cops looked at him, like he was already guilty, like they'd seen 100 sons like him and 100 fathers like me. And I didn't sleep, couldn't sleep, just kept replaying everything. The birthday, the words, the walk, the arrest, and I knew I had to go down to the station, not to bail him out, not to defend him, but to understand, to see the report, to read the truth written in ink instead of emotion, and when I got there, the desk sergeant looked at me like I was the ghost of a man who used to matter, and he handed me the file without a word, just slid it across the counter like it was a bill I forgot to pay, and I opened it slowly, like peeling back the skin of a wound. And there it was, disturbance call, verbal threats, destruction of property, neighbor testimony, and then the part that hit hardest, subject expressed intent to harm himself and others, cited abandonment and emotional trauma as triggers, and I swear my knees buckled, not because of the words, but because I knew they were true, because I saw it in his eyes before they cuffed him, that storm, that ache, that scream he couldn't let out. And I asked if I could see him, and they said no, said he was under observation, said he needed evaluation, and I nodded like I understood, but inside I was screaming, because this wasn't just about him losing control, this was about me losing him, piece by piece, year by year, until all that was left was a boy with a beard and a broken heart, and I walked out of that station feeling like I'd just buried something, maybe my pride, maybe my hope, maybe both, and I went back home. Back to the mess, and started cleaning, not because I wanted to, but because it felt like the only thing I could control, and as I swept up the glass, I found the photo he tore, the one of me holding him at the beach, his little arms wrapped around my neck, both of us smiling like the world couldn't touch us, and I taped it back together, piece by piece, like I was trying to fix something bigger than paper, and I sat there staring at it, wondering when that smile turned into a mask, when that hug turned into distance, and I thought about all the birthdays I missed, all the games I didn't attend, all the nights I told him I was too tired to talk, and maybe he didn't hate me, maybe he just didn't know how to love me anymore, and maybe I didn't know how to love him in the way he needed, and I kept thinking about the last thing he said before I left, I want you gone, and I wondered if he regretted it, if he meant it, if he even remembered saying it. And I wanted to believe that somewhere inside him was still that boy who cried when he lost his toy car, who hugged me tight when thunder scared him, who called me Dad like it meant safety, and I knew I couldn't fix everything, couldn't undo the years, but I could try, I could show up, I could be there, even if he didn't want me, even if he never forgave me, and I picked up my phone and called the hospital, asked if he was okay, if he was talking, if he was eating, and they said he was quiet, withdrawn. Said he hadn't asked for anyone, hadn't mentioned me, and that hurt more than anything. Because silence from your child feels like exile, and I asked if I could send something, maybe a letter, maybe a photo, and they said yes, so I wrote, not a speech, not an apology, just a memory, about the time we built a treehouse together, how he hammered the nails crooked and laughed when it leaned sideways, how we sat up there eating peanut butter sandwiches and pretending we were kings, and I ended it with, I'm still here, son. No matter what, and I sent it, hoping it would reach him, hoping it would crack something open, and then I waited. Waited like a man on trial, like a father hoping for redemption, and the hours felt like years, and I kept checking my phone, kept pacing, kept praying, and somewhere in that waiting, I realized this wasn't just his story, it was mine too, and maybe the sirens weren't just chasing him, maybe they were chasing me, chasing the guilt, the silence, the distance, and maybe this arrest was the beginning of something, not the end. Maybe it was the moment we both had to face the truth, and as the sun dipped low and the sky turned orange like a bruise, I sat on the porch and whispered, come back to me, even though I knew he couldn't hear it, even though I didn't know if he ever would. 3 days passed like slow poison, each hour dragging its nails across my chest, and when the hospital finally called and said he was stable enough for a visitor, I didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, just grabbed my coat and drove through the rain like the sky was mourning with me, and when I walked into that sterile hallway, the smell of antiseptic and regret hit me like a punch, and the nurse pointed to his room. Said he hadn't spoken much, hadn't asked for anyone, hadn't even looked out the window, and I nodded, heart pounding like a drum in a funeral march, and when I stepped inside, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor like it held all the answers he'd been searching for, and I didn't say his name, didn't rush to hug him, just stood there, waiting, letting the silence speak first, and after a minute, he looked up, eyes tired, face pale, and said, you came. Like it was both a question and a confession, and I said, I never left, and that broke. Something in him, I saw it, the way his shoulders sagged, the way his lips trembled, and he looked away, said, I didn't mean it, and I wanted to believe him, wanted to grab those words and stitch them into my soul, but I knew pain doesn't lie, it just speaks in riddles, and I sat down beside him, close but not too close, and we just sat there, two men bound by blood and brokenness, and he started talking, slow and shaky, about how he felt invisible growing up, how he thought I loved my job more than him, how every birthday felt like a reminder that I wasn't really there, and I listened, didn't defend, didn't interrupt, just let him bleed, and he said he didn't know why he snapped, didn't know why he said what he said, just knew it came from a place he didn't understand, and I told him I failed too, told him I thought I was doing the right thing by providing, by staying strong, by being the man I thought he needed. But maybe I was just building walls he couldn't climb, and he nodded, tears finally falling, and I reached out, placed my hand on his, and he didn't pull away, just gripped it like a lifeline, and we sat like that, father and son, not healed, not whole, but willing, and I told him about the photo I taped back together, about the letter I sent, and he said he read it, said it made him cry, said it reminded him of the treehouse and the peanut butter sandwiches and the way I used to call him, champ, and I smiled, said, you'll always be my champ, and he broke again, sobbing into my chest like he was 5 years old, and I held him like I was holding time itself, and the nurse peeked in, saw us, and quietly closed the door, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't the end, wasn't the fix, but it was a start, and I told him we'd figure it out, therapy, talks, walks, whatever it took, and he said he wanted that, said he was tired of being angry, tired of feeling lost, and I told him I was tired too, tired of pretending I was okay, tired of carrying guilt like a second skin, and we made a promise, right there in that hospital room, to try, to show up, to speak even when it hurts, and as the rain tapped against the window like a soft applause, I whispered, Happy birthday, son, and he smiled, weak but real, and said, Thanks for not disappearing, and I said, Never, and we sat there, two broken men trying to rebuild something sacred, something that once felt unbreakable, and maybe we wouldn't get it all back, maybe some pieces were lost forever, but we had this moment, this truth, this fragile thread of love, and that was enough to begin again. The first therapy session hit me like walking into a courtroom where the judge was silence and the jury was memory, and I swear the air in that room was heavier than any prison cell, beige walls staring us down, a clock ticking louder than our voices, and me and my son sitting across from each other like strangers who used to share the same blood, and the therapist, calm but sharp-eyed, asked us to talk, to peel back the years, to bleed in words instead of wounds, and my son looked at me, eyes sharp but trembling, and said, You were never there, and I swallowed hard because I knew he wasn't lying, and I said, I thought I was doing right by working, by keeping the lights on, by paying the bills, but he shook his head, said, I didn't need money, I needed you, and that cut deeper than any blade, because I remembered the nights I came home late, the mornings I left early, the birthdays I missed, the games I skipped, and I thought I was building a future for him, but maybe I was just building a wall between us, and the therapist asked him to share a memory, and he said, I remember waiting by the window for you to come home, and you didn't, and Mom said you were busy, and I cried myself to sleep, and I wanted to disappear right there, wanted to crawl out of my own skin, because I remembered that night too, remembered the meeting that ran late, the excuse I told myself, and I said, I'm sorry. But sorry felt like ashes, too light, too late, and he said, Do you know what it feels like to want your father more than anything and realize he's just a ghost? And I couldn't answer, just sat there with tears burning behind my eyes, and the therapist leaned in, said, this is the moment to speak, not defend, and I nodded, said, I failed you, son, I thought being strong meant being absent, I thought love was sacrifice, but maybe I sacrificed the wrong things, and he looked at me, softer now, said, I wanted freedom from the pain, not from you, and that hit me like a revelation, because all this time I thought he hated me, thought he wanted me gone, but maybe he just wanted the hurt gone, and I said, I can't erase the past, but I can be here now, if you'll let me, and he didn't answer right away, just stared at the floor, then whispered, I don't know if I can trust you, and I said, then let me earn it, and the therapist smiled faintly, said, that's where healing begins, and we sat there, two men chained by history, trying to break free, and I realized the law gave him chains, but maybe love could give him wings, and as the session ended, he stood up, didn't hug me, didn't smile, but he didn't walk away either, just stood there waiting, and I knew that was something, a crack in the wall, a chance, and I whispered, I'll be here, every step, and he nodded, barely, but enough, and we walked out together, not healed, not whole, but side by side, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe we weren't enemies, maybe we were survivors, and maybe this was the start of a story neither of us knew how to write but both of us needed to live, and later that night I sat alone replaying every word, every look, every silence, and I thought about how chains don't just come from cops or courts, they come from guilt, from regret, from the weight of unspoken love, and I realized I'd been cuffed too, cuffed by my own mistakes, by the nights I chose work over him, by the times I told him to toughen up instead of asking what hurt. And I thought about the way he said he wanted freedom, and I wondered if freedom meant cutting me out or letting me back in, and I prayed it was the second, prayed that maybe this therapy wasn't just a session, maybe it was a doorway, and I remembered the way he cried in the hospital, the way he gripped my hand like it was the last rope keeping him from drowning, and I held on to that memory like a lifeline. Because I knew storms don't pass in a day, they linger, they test you, they break you before they heal you, and I promised myself I wouldn't run this time, wouldn't disappear, wouldn't let him fight alone, and as I sat there in the dark, the house quiet, the photo of us taped back together staring at me from the table, I whispered, we'll get through this, champ, even though he couldn't hear me, even though I didn't know if he believed it, and I thought about how birthdays are supposed to be celebrations. But his 26th became a battlefield, a reckoning, a chain, and maybe that's what it had to be, maybe sometimes love has to break before it can rebuild, and I closed my eyes and saw him as a boy again, running through the yard, laughing, calling me dad, and I held on to that image like it was the only truth left, because deep down I knew the law gave him chains, but I still had the power to give him freedom, not by disappearing, not by surrendering, but by staying, by showing up, by being the father he thought he lost. And I swore to myself that no matter how long it took, no matter how many sessions, no matter how many tears, I would earn back his trust, because chains can break, walls can fall, and even ghosts can come back to life if love is strong enough to carry them home. The days after therapy felt like walking on cracked glass, every step careful, every word heavy, and though we had promised to try, promised to show up, promised to speak even when it hurt, the silence between us still lingered like smoke after a fire, and I could feel it in the house, in the way he moved through rooms without looking at me, in the way he sat at the table with his head down, scrolling through his phone like it was the only world he trusted, and I wanted to break that silence. Wanted to reach across the distance, but every time I opened my mouth, the words felt too small, too fragile, too late, and I kept thinking about the therapy session, about the way he said he didn't know if he could trust me, and those words echoed in my chest like a verdict, and I knew trust wasn't built in a day, wasn't rebuilt in a single tear or a single hug, it was a slow climb, a painful crawl, and I had to prove myself, not with speeches but with presence, with patience, with the kind of Love that doesn't demand but waits, and so I waited, sat with him in silence, cooked dinner even when he didn't eat, left notes on the fridge even when he didn't read them, and I remembered the therapist saying healing begins with consistency, and I tried to be consistent, tried to be there without smothering, tried to show up without forcing, and one night, while he was sitting on the porch staring at the streetlights, I joined him, sat beside him without a word, and after a long pause he said, "I don't know how to forgive you," and I said, "Then don't, not yet, just let me be here," and he nodded, eyes wet but refusing to fall, and that was enough, a crack in the wall, a breath in the silence, and I thought maybe we were moving, slowly, painfully, but moving, and the next morning he left early, didn't say where, didn't say when he'd be back, and I sat there waiting, heart pounding like a drum, and when he returned hours later, he dropped a folder on the table, said it was his police report, said he wanted me to read it, and I opened it, hands shaking, and there it was in black and white, the words of neighbors, the statements of officers, the description of his rage, his threats, his pain, and I read it all, every line, every accusation, and when I looked up, he was staring at me, waiting, and I said, "I see your pain, I see your anger, but I also see your fight, and I'm not walking away," and he broke, slammed his fist on the table, said, "You don't get it, Dad, you don't get what it feels like to be chained by your own blood, to feel like your shadow follows me everywhere, like I can't breathe without remembering you weren't there when I needed you," and I let him rage, let him spill, let him tear me apart, because maybe that was the only way to heal, and when he finally stopped, chest heaving, eyes red, I said, "You're right, I don't get it, but I want to understand, I want to carry it with you." And he stared at me, broken, and whispered, "I don't know if I can believe that," and I said, "Then let me prove it, day by day, moment by moment," and he didn't answer, just walked away, and I sat there alone, staring at the report, at the words that painted him as a criminal, but I knew he wasn't just that, he was my son, my blood, my storm, my regret, and I thought about the way shadows work, how they follow you even when you don't want them, how they cling to your steps, and I realized I was his shadow, the regret he couldn't shake, the ghost he couldn't outrun, and maybe that was my punishment, maybe that was my role, to be the reminder, to be the weight, until he found a way to forgive or forget, and I whispered to myself, "I'll carry it, son, I'll carry it all," and the house felt heavier, the air thicker, but I stayed, because leaving would have been easy, disappearing would have been simple, but staying, showing up, facing the storm, that was the gift he didn't ask for but maybe needed, and as the night fell and the streetlights hummed outside, I sat in the dark, waiting for him to come back, waiting for another crack in the wall, waiting for the day my shadow would stop being his regret and start being his strength, and I knew it wouldn't be tomorrow, maybe not next week, maybe not even next year, but I was ready, ready to fight for him, ready to bleed for him, ready to prove that even broken fathers can still love, even shattered families can still rebuild. And I whispered into the silence, "I'm here, champ, I'm not leaving." And somewhere in the house, I swear I heard him breathe, not words, not forgiveness, just a breath, and maybe that was enough to keep me alive, enough to keep me fighting, enough to keep me believing that chains can break, shadows can fade, and regret can turn into redemption if you hold on long enough. The house felt like a cage that week, walls breathing with secrets, floors creaking with regret, and every time I walked past his room, I heard echoes, not voices, not sounds, but memories, the kind that crawl under your skin and refuse to leave, and one night, when the silence was too loud, I knocked on his door, slow, hesitant, like a man knocking on his own grave, and he opened it, eyes tired, face pale, and said, "What do you want?" And I said, "To talk," and he let me in, not with warmth, not with welcome, but with resignation, and I stepped inside, saw the mess, clothes scattered, papers torn, a broken lamp in the corner, and I thought about the day he told me to disappear, how those words still lived in this room, how they still haunted me, and I sat down on the edge of his bed, the same bed where I used to tuck him in, where I used to read him stories, and I said, I need to tell you something, and he crossed his arms, leaned against the wall, waiting, and I told him about my father, about the man who raised me with fists instead of words, about the nights I hid under the table while he raged, about the mornings I went to school with bruises hidden under long sleeves, and I said, I swore I'd never be him, swore I'd never let my son feel that kind of pain, but maybe I failed in a different way, maybe I hurt you by being absent instead of violent, maybe I thought silence was safer than anger. But silence can kill too, and he looked at me, eyes wide, like he was seeing me for the first time, and he said, why didn't you ever tell me that? And I said, because I wanted you to see me as strong, not broken, but maybe you needed to see the cracks, and he sat down, closer now, said, so you were running from him, and I was running from you, and I nodded, tears burning, said, yeah, and maybe we both got lost, and he whispered, I hated you for not being there. But maybe I hated you because I thought you didn't care, and now I don't know what to feel. And I said, feel whatever you need, son, anger, sadness, confusion, just don't shut me out, don't let silence win, and he broke, fists pounding the mattress, voice shaking, said, do you know what it's like to grow up thinking you're not enough, thinking your own father chose work over you? Thinking every birthday was just another reminder that you weren't worth showing up for, and I let him rage, let him spill, let him tear me apart, because maybe that was the only way to heal, and when he finally stopped, chest heaving, eyes red, I said, I can't change the past, but I can change now, I can be here, I can fight for us, and he looked at me, broken, whispered, I don't know if I can believe that, and I said, then let me prove it, day by day, moment by moment, and he didn't answer, just stared at the floor, and the room felt heavy, like the walls were listening, like the echoes of his birthday were still alive. And I thought about the way he said he wanted me gone, how those words cut deeper than any knife, and I realized they weren't just anger, they were history, they were the weight of years, and maybe this room would always carry them. Maybe this house would always remember, but maybe we could write new echoes, maybe we could drown the old ones with laughter, with truth, with love, and I told him that, told him we could rebuild, and he said, what if I don't know how, and I said, then we'll learn together, and he nodded, barely, but enough, and I felt something shift, not forgiveness, not healing, but a crack in the wall, a breath in the silence, and I knew it wasn't over, knew the storm wasn't done, but I also knew we weren't alone in it anymore, and as the night stretched on and the room grew darker, I sat there with him, two men bound by blood and brokenness, trying to rewrite a story that had been written in pain, and I whispered, you're my son, and I'll never stop fighting for you. And he whispered back, then don't disappear, and I said, never, and the room, the same room where he told me to leave, where he shattered me with words, now held something new, something fragile, something alive, and I knew it would echo forever, not just with pain, but with the sound of two voices refusing to give up, refusing to let silence win, refusing to let regret be the only story we told. The first time we tried to sit down for dinner after everything felt like walking into a battlefield disguised as a kitchen, the table set with plates that looked more like shields, the air thick with unspoken words, and I cooked his favorite meal, spaghetti with too much sauce, the way he used to like it when he was a kid, hoping maybe food could bridge the silence, hoping maybe the smell of garlic and tomatoes could remind him of better days. And when he walked in, he didn't smile, didn't thank me, just sat down, fork in hand, eyes on the plate, and I sat across from him, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything, and for a few minutes we ate in silence, the sound of forks scraping against plates louder than our voices, and I thought maybe this was progress, maybe this was healing, but then he looked up, eyes sharp, voice low, and said, "You think spaghetti fixes 26 years of pain?" And I froze. Fork halfway to my mouth, and I said, "No, son, I don't, but it's a start," and he laughed, bitter, said, "A start. You think showing up now erases all the times you didn't," and I wanted to defend myself, wanted to explain, but I remembered the therapist's words, "Don't defend, just listen," and so I listened as he poured out years of anger, years of silence, years of birthdays spent alone, and he said, "You raised a storm, Dad," and I became the thunder, loud, destructive, uncontrollable, because I didn't know how else to be. And I felt those words cut through me, because he was right, I had raised him in absence, raised him in silence, raised him in shadows, and now he was the storm I couldn't calm, the thunder I couldn't silence, and I said, "I hear you, I see you, and I'm sorry," and he slammed his fork down, said, "Sorry doesn't change the past," and I said, "No, but it can change the future," and he stared at me, eyes wet, voice trembling, said, "I don't know if I want you in my future," and that broke me, shattered me. But I didn't leave, didn't walk away, just sat there, steady. And said, "Then let me earn it," and he looked at me, long and hard, and for a moment I thought he'd walk out, thought he'd slam the door, but instead he stayed in the storm, stayed in the thunder, and we sat there, two men bound by blood and brokenness, eating spaghetti like it was the Last Supper, and I thought about all the times I missed, all the moments I lost, and I realized this dinner wasn't about food, it was about presence, about showing up, about proving I wasn't going to disappear again, and as the night stretched on, the storm quieted, the thunder softened, and he whispered, "I don't know how to forgive you," and I said, "Then don't, not yet, just let me be here," and he nodded, barely, but enough, and I knew it wasn't healing, wasn't forgiveness, but it was something, a crack in the wall, a breath in the silence, and I held on to that, held on to the hope that maybe storms don't last forever, maybe thunder fades, maybe fathers and sons can rebuild even after the world breaks them, and as I washed the dishes later, alone, I whispered to myself, "We'll get through this, champ," even though he couldn't hear me, even though I didn't know if he believed it, and I thought about the way storms work, how they destroy but also cleanse, how thunder shakes the earth but also clears the sky, and I realized maybe he was the thunder because I was the storm, and maybe together we could find calm, maybe together we could find peace, and I swore to myself I wouldn't run, wouldn't disappear, wouldn't let silence win, because this was my son, my blood, my storm, my thunder, and I would fight for him until the sky cleared, until the chains broke, until the echoes turned into laughter, and I whispered into the night, "I'm here, I'm not leaving," and somewhere in the house, I swear I heard him breathe, not words, not forgiveness, just a breath, and maybe that was enough to keep me alive, enough to keep me fighting, enough to keep me believing that storms can pass, thunder can fade, and love, even broken, can still rebuild. The night he finally spoke the truth felt like the kind of storm that doesn't just pass but rewrites the sky, and it started with him slamming the door behind me, eyes burning, voice shaking, saying, "You think therapy fixes this? You think spaghetti dinners fix this? You don't even know what you did," and I stood there, steady but trembling inside, because I knew this was the moment where silence would break, where the past would bleed out, and he paced the room like a caged animal, fists clenched, jaw tight, and he said, "You weren't just absent, Dad, you were gone when I needed you most, when Mom cried herself to sleep, when bills piled up, when I felt like the world was crushing me, and you weren't there. You were chasing money, chasing pride, chasing everything but me," and I wanted to defend myself, wanted to say I was trying to build a future, but I remembered the therapist's words, "Don't defend, just listen," and so I listened as he poured out years of pain, years of anger, years of nights staring at the ceiling wondering why his father chose the world over him, and he said, "Do you know what it feels like to be handcuffed not just by cops but by your own blood? To feel like every mistake I made was just me screaming for you to notice me," and I felt those words cut deeper than any blade, because I realized the handcuffs weren't just metal, they were history, they were silence, they were the chains I wrapped around him without even knowing, and I said, "I see you, son, I see your pain, I see your anger, and I'm sorry," but he shook his head, tears falling now, said, "Sorry doesn't change the nights I cried alone, sorry doesn't change the birthdays you missed, sorry doesn't change the fact that I grew up thinking I wasn't enough," and I broke, knees weak, voice trembling, said, "You were always enough, you were always my champ, I just didn't know how to show it," and he stared at me, broken, whispered, "Then why did you leave that night, why did you smile and walk away when I told you to disappear?" And I swallowed hard, said, "Because I thought that's what you wanted, thought that was the gift you needed, thought disappearing was love," and he screamed, voice cracking, "I didn't want you gone. I wanted you to fight for me, I wanted you to stay, I wanted you to prove you cared," and those words shattered me, because I realized I had misunderstood everything, misunderstood his anger, his pain, his plea, and I thought leaving was mercy, but maybe it was betrayal, maybe it was the final wound, and I said, "I'm here now, I'm not leaving again, I'll fight, I'll stay, I'll prove it," and he collapsed onto the couch, sobbing, fists pounding the cushions, and I sat beside him, not touching, not forcing, just present, and he said, "I hated you, Dad, I hated you so much, but I don't know how to stop," and I whispered, "Then let me carry that hate with you, let me walk through it with you, let me earn back your love," and he looked at me, eyes red, voice broken, said, "I don't know if I can forgive you," and I said, "Then don't, not yet, just let me be here," and we sat there, two men bound by blood and brokenness, chained by history, trying to break free, and I thought about the way handcuffs work, how they bind you, how they restrict you, but also how they can be unlocked, and I realized maybe love was the key, maybe presence was the key, maybe staying was the key, and I swore to myself I wouldn't run, wouldn't disappear, wouldn't let silence win, because this was my son, my blood, my storm, my truth, and I would fight for him until the chains broke, until the echoes turned into laughter, until the handcuffs turned into open hands, and as the night stretched on and the house grew quiet, I whispered, "You're my son, and I'll never stop fighting for you," and he whispered back, "Then don't disappear," and I said, "Never," and the truth that came wrapped in handcuffs, now lived between us, heavy but real, painful but alive, and I knew it would take time, knew it would take tears, knew it would take storms, but I also knew we weren't alone anymore, and maybe that was enough, maybe that was the beginning of redemption, maybe that was the start of a story neither of us knew how to write but both of us needed to live, and I sat there, holding on to that fragile thread, believing that even broken fathers can still love, even shattered sons can still heal, and even handcuffs can break if love is strong enough to carry them home. The last chapter of this story didn't come with fireworks or grand speeches, it came with silence, the kind that wraps around your chest and squeezes until you can barely breathe, and it started on a cold morning when I got the call, the kind of call that makes your blood freeze before you even answer, and the voice on the other end said my son had been released, said he was coming home, said the storm was over for now. And I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the photo I had taped back together, the one of me holding him at the beach, and I thought about all the years between that smile and this silence, all the birthdays missed, all the words unsaid, all the nights spent wondering if I was raising a son or losing one, and when he walked through the door, he didn't look like the boy I remembered, didn't look like the man I feared, he looked like something in between, tired eyes, heavy shoulders, a soul carrying too much weight. And I stood up, heart pounding, wanting to hug him, wanting to hold him, but I didn't move, just waited, and he said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, Dad, but I don't want to hate you anymore," and those words hit me harder than any punch, because forgiveness is a mountain, but hate is a prison, and maybe breaking free from that prison was enough, and I said, "I'll take that, son, I'll take anything you give me," and he nodded, sat down, and for the first time in years, we talked, not about therapy, not about police reports, not about chains or storms, but about life, about small things, about music he liked, about movies he watched, about the way the world felt too heavy sometimes, and I listened, really listened, and I realized this was the gift, not forgiveness, not healing, but presence, the chance to sit across from my son and hear his voice without anger, without venom, without silence, and as the hours passed, the house felt lighter, the air felt warmer, and I thought maybe we were finally finding our way back, but then he said something that broke me all over again. He said, "I called you father again last night, in my head, not dad, not pops, just father," and it felt strange, felt heavy, but it felt real, and I smiled, tears burning, said, "I'll take that too," but inside I was shattered, because father is formal, father is distant, father is a title, not a bond, and I wanted dad, I wanted champ. I wanted the boy who once cried for me when thunder scared him, but maybe father was all he could give. Maybe father was the bridge between hate and love, and I accepted it, held on to it, because sometimes you don't get the words you want, you get the words you need, and as the night fell and the streetlights hummed outside, we sat on the porch together, two men bound by blood and brokenness, watching the world move without us, and he whispered, "I don't know if we'll ever be okay," and I said, "Maybe not, but we'll try," and he nodded, barely, but enough, and I thought about the way stories end. How they don't always end with redemption, don't always end with forgiveness, sometimes they end with survival, with two people choosing not to disappear, choosing to stay, choosing to fight, and I realized that was enough, that was the gift, that was the truth, and as I closed my eyes, I whispered, "You're my son, and I'll never stop fighting for you," and he whispered back, "Then don't disappear," and I said, "Never," and the echoes of his birthday, the sirens, the handcuffs, the therapy sessions, the dinners, the storms, all of it lived inside us, heavy but real, painful but alive, and I knew it would take time, knew it would take tears, knew it would take storms, but I also knew we weren't alone anymore, and maybe that was enough, maybe that was the beginning of redemption, maybe that was the start of a story neither of us knew how to write but both of us needed to live, and as the night stretched on and the house grew quiet, I sat there holding on to that fragile thread, believing that even broken fathers can still love, even shattered sons can still heal, and even handcuffs can break if love is strong enough to carry them home, and though he called me father again, not dad, not pops, just father, I held on to it like a lifeline, because sometimes the word itself doesn't matter, sometimes it's the presence, the fight, the refusal to disappear, and I swore to myself I would never leave again, never walk away, never smile and vanish. Because this was my son, my blood, my storm, my truth, and I would fight for him until the chains broke, until the echoes turned into laughter, until father turned back into dad, and maybe it would take years, maybe it would never happen, but I would stay, I would fight, I would love, because that's what fathers do, even when it's too late, even when the word itself feels heavy, even when the bond feels fragile. And I whispered into the silence, "I'm here, champ, I'm not leaving," and somewhere in the house, I swear I heard him breathe, not words, not forgiveness, just a breath, and maybe that was enough to keep me alive, enough to keep me fighting, enough to keep me believing that even broken stories can still find light at the end.